Sign it, Suzanne. It's already done. Brooke slid the papers across my kitchen table like she was handing me a receipt. A notary sat beside her pen uncapped. My own son stood behind them, both silent arms crossed, eyes on the floor. They had come to take everything, my house, my land, my life's worth, and they were smiling while they did it. What they didn't know was that I had been ready for this exact moment for 6 months. The deed to an $11 million ranch was locked in my lawyer's safe, and the moment they walked through my door, they had already lost. If this story speaks to you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because I promise you, this does not end the way they planned. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. I want to start by telling you something about silence. Not the peaceful kind, not the silence of a Sunday morning, or the quiet that settles after the last guest leaves a good dinner. I mean the other kind. The kind that has weight. The kind that presses against your chest when you're sitting in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, and you realize slowly, and then all at once, that something is very, very wrong. That's the silence I lived in for almost 2 years before I finally did something about it. My name is Suzanne. I'm 69 years old. I have brown eyes that my late husband Carl used to call coffee-warm hands that have kneaded more bread dough than I can count, and a heart that I have spent most of my life giving away, sometimes wisely, sometimes not. I raised my son Matthew in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb of Spokane, Washington. I taught him to ride a bike in the driveway. I sat with him through every fever, every nightmare, every broken heart from middle school through college. When Carl died 8 years ago after a sudden heart attack, it was Matthew who held my hand at the funeral. It was Matthew who called me every single Sunday morning for 3 years straight after that. I thought I knew my son. I thought I did. The first time I met Brooke, Matthew brought her to my house for dinner. It was a Tuesday in October, leaves coming down fast outside, and I had made a pot roast, Carl's favorite, which had become Matthew's favorite too. She walked in behind him, small and sharp-featured, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, not too wide, not too warm, just enough to pass. "Mom, this is Brooke," Matthew said. He was beaming. He looked like a boy who had found something he was afraid of losing. "Suzanne," I said, extending my hand, "so good to finally meet you." "Likewise," she said. And that was it. One word. No warmth behind it. But I told myself I was projecting. I told myself first impressions are hard for everyone, especially meeting a boyfriend's mother for the first time. I set the table, I poured the wine, I asked her questions about her work. She was in real estate finance, she said, which I thought was interesting. She answered each question with the minimum number of words required and then turned back to Matthew. By the end of that dinner, I had done 80% of the talking. I told myself she's shy. I told myself give her time, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe, small enough to ignore, but always there. Matthew proposed to Brooke the following April. He called me the morning after it happened, and he was so happy that I set the stone aside completely. His joy was real. That at least I was certain of. He told me about the ring, about how she cried, about how they were thinking of a small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Walla Walla. "Mom," he said, "I really want you two to be close. She's had a hard life. She doesn't trust easily, but she's a good person, I know it." "Then I'll try harder," I said, and I meant it. I brought Brooke flowers the next weekend. I offered to take her to lunch to talk about the wedding. I sent her a card for her birthday in July, a real card, the kind you write by hand and buy at a stationery shop, not a text message. She texted back a single thumbs-up emoji. I told myself that was fine. I told myself some people communicate differently. But here's what I noticed. She was never shy with anyone else. At the engagement party that Matthew's friend Derek hosted, she was loud, funny, the center of attention. She knew how to work a room. She knew how to make people feel chosen. She just chose not to aim any of that at me. There was a reason for that. I didn't understand it then. I do now. The wedding was September 14th, the kind of fall day in eastern Washington that feels almost too beautiful to be real. Golden light, cool air, the smell of dry grass and distant harvest. I wore a deep blue dress that Carl would have liked. I sat in the front row and I watched my son get married, and I cried the way you cry when something is both wonderful and terrifying at the same time. At the reception, Brooke barely acknowledged me. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was overwhelmed. I danced by myself to one song and watched Matthew spin his new wife across the floor, and I thought, okay, this is a new chapter. Let her have him. That's what you're supposed to do. I went home that night and sat in the kitchen where I'd raised him, and it was the first time in 20 years that the quiet felt lonely instead of restful. The changes started small. Matthew's Sunday calls got shorter, then they came every other week, then once a month. I told myself he's married, now he's busy. This is normal. I reached out instead of waiting, sent texts, suggested dinners. Half of them were ignored. The other half were postponed indefinitely. When I did see them, it was always on Brooke's terms at their house, and she had a way of redirecting every conversation away from me. If I said something about my week, she'd cut across it with something about hers. If I tried to talk to Matthew privately, just the two of us in the kitchen, while she was in the other room, she appeared within 2 minutes every single time, like she had a sensor. I started to feel invisible in my own son's life. And then came the comments. They started innocuously enough. This neighborhood must feel pretty empty now that Matthew's gone. Then, you know women your age really benefit from community living. Have you ever looked into those senior places? And once when I brought over a casserole, the same chicken and rice dish I'd made Matthew 100 times, she looked at it and said, "Oh, we're mostly plant-based now," and handed it back to me at the door without inviting me inside. She handed it back to me at the door. I stood on the front step with my casserole dish and I heard the door click shut. And I thought, who are you? I thought, what have you done with my son? I thought, what is actually happening here? That night I called my friend Rachel. Rachel is 72. She has 4 kids and 6 grandchildren and a mind like a steel trap. She's the kind of woman who has seen enough of life to call things by their right names. She's positioning you, Rachel said without hesitating. She's slowly moving you out of the picture so that when the time comes, it doesn't look like a push. It looks like you drifted. The time comes for what? I asked. That depends on what she wants, Rachel said. What do you have, Suzanne? I was quiet for a long moment. A house, I said, and the ranch. Another silence on Rachel's end. Then, does Matthew know about the ranch? No, I said quietly. I never told him. The ranch. I have to explain the ranch. When Carl died, I assumed he had left behind what we'd always talked about the house. The retirement account's a modest inheritance for Matthew. Carl was careful with money, sensible, never flashy. What I did not know, what Carl had never told me, was that his father, a man named Earl Whitmore, who I had met exactly twice before he died, had left Carl a land inheritance that Carl himself had almost forgotten about. 412 acres in eastern Washington, outside a small town called Palouse. Rolling hills, old farmland, partially leased to neighboring operations for wheat. Carl had inherited it as a young man, paid the property taxes faithfully every year, and then I genuinely believe this simply didn't know how to bring it up. We were never wealthy people. We lived carefully, saved carefully. I think in Carl's mind the land was just land, something abstract, something far away. The estate lawyer, a quiet man named Robert Hayes, who had handled Carl's affairs for 20 years, called me 3 weeks after the funeral. He explained everything. He sent me the documents. He walked me through what the land was worth, and I sat at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear and could not speak for almost a full minute. $11 million, conservative estimate based on comparable land sales. Possibly more if we considered development potential along a certain ridge. $11 million worth of land that I now owned outright, that I had never known existed. I sat with that information for a long time. I didn't tell Matthew. I know that needs explaining. I know a mother hiding something like that from her child sounds strange, even suspicious. But here's what I'll tell you. Robert Hayes advised me to be careful. Take your time, he said. You've just lost your husband. You're in grief. Don't make any announcements until you fully understand what you have. And there was something else, something instinctive. A quiet voice that said, wait. Know what you have before you share it. Make sure you're protected. Make sure everyone around you is safe. I thought that voice was grief talking. I thought I was being paranoid. 2 years after Matthew's wedding, I understood that voice had been the wisest thing inside me. It was a Wednesday morning in early March when Matthew called, and I knew immediately something was wrong. Not from what he said. He opened with small talk, whether something about a project at work. I knew because of the pause before he spoke. The half-second delay that told me he had rehearsed this. "Mom," he finally said, "Brooke and I have been talking. We're worried about you." "I'm fine, Matthew," I said. "Why would you be worried? The house is a lot for you to manage alone. And financially, I mean, you're on a fixed income, right? Are you okay? Do you need anything?" I took a slow breath. "I manage just fine," I said. "We were just thinking," he said, and I could hear Brooke's words coming out of his mouth like he was reading from a script, "that it might make sense to look at some options. You know, somewhere with more support. And the house, the market is really strong right now. You could get a great price, and that would give you a cushion." "Matthew," I stopped him. "I am 69 years old. I am healthy. I am not ready to sell my home." A pause. "Okay," he said. "We're just saying it's something to think about." I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing Rachel warned me about. That afternoon, I drove to Robert Hayes's office. Robert is in his late 60s himself, calm, measured, the kind of man who has seen enough family disputes over estates that nothing surprises him anymore. I told him about the conversation. I told him about the past 2 years, the gradual distancing, the comments, the way Brooke had been slowly turning Matthew against any closeness with me. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Suzanne, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you made a will that makes your wishes clear about the ranch and the house?" "I have a will," I said, "but it needs updating." "Then let's start there," he said. "And let me ask you something else. How protected is the deed to the ranch? Who knows about it besides us?" "Rachel," I said. "That's all." Robert nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way for now." We spent 2 hours in that office. By the time I left, I had set in motion something that would take 3 months to finalize a restructured will, a trust established in my name, the ranch deed secured in a way that could not be undone by a notary showing up unannounced at my kitchen table. I drove home in the early evening light, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, more like readiness, because I knew. The way you know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears. I knew they were not finished. I knew Brooke had a plan, and that Matthew, whether he understood it fully or not, had become part of it. I knew that whatever they were preparing, they were going to move on it soon. I was right. They moved on it 7 weeks later. On a Thursday morning, my doorbell rang at 9:45. I looked through the window before I answered it. Matthew stood on the porch, and beside him was a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, carrying a leather briefcase, wearing the kind of suit that says, "I am official." And behind both of them, standing just slightly back, was Brooke. She was wearing a blazer. She looked like she was going to a business meeting. She looked like she had come to close a deal. I stood at the door for just a moment before I opened it. I felt my heart rate go up, not from fear, I need you to understand that, from focus. The way Carl used to describe the feeling before a difficult conversation, sharp, clear, ready. I opened the door. "Matthew," I said. "I wasn't expecting you." "Hi, Mom." He tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to drop by like this. Can we come in?" I looked at the man with the briefcase. I looked at Brooke, who was watching me with that same calibrated expression she'd worn the first night I met her. Careful, measuring. "Who is this?" I asked, nodding toward the man. "This is Paul," Matthew said. "He's a notary. We have some paperwork. We thought it would be easier to just come over and go through it together." Paperwork, a notary, on a Thursday morning, unannounced. I looked at my son and I thought, how did we get here? How did the boy I raised in this house become the man standing on my porch with a notary and his wife and a briefcase full of papers designed to take everything away from me? And then, because I am 69 years old and I have earned every one of those years, I stepped aside and I said, "Come in." Because they had no idea what was waiting for them on the other side of that door. They had no idea that the moment they walked into my kitchen, the story they thought they were writing was already over. They had no idea that while they were planning their move, I had been 3 steps ahead of them for months. They came in. Paul set his briefcase on my kitchen table. Brooke sat down without being invited. Matthew stayed standing, and he still wouldn't look me in the eye. Paul opened the briefcase and took out a folder. He set it on the table and slid it toward me the way someone slides a menu casual, practiced as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "if you'll just take a look at the first page." I did not reach for the folder. I looked at Brooke instead. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked back at me without the smile, without the calculation. Just a direct, steady look, like 2 people finally dropping a pretense. "Tell me, Brooke," I said, and my voice was very quiet. "What exactly do you think is in this house that's worth all of this trouble?" The room went still. Matthew shifted. Paul cleared his throat. Brooke held my gaze for 3 seconds, and then she looked away first. That was the moment I knew I had already won. But winning, as it turns out, is more complicated than simply being right. There were still things that had to happen before the truth could come fully into the light. There were still conversations that would break my heart before they healed anything. There were still documents to be revealed, confrontations to be had, and a choice that Matthew would have to make about who he was and who his mother was, and whether the life Brooke had built for them was worth the price of losing everything else. I sat down at my kitchen table across from the 3 of them. I folded my hands, and I said in the calmest voice I have used in my entire life, "I think there are some things you don't know about me, and I think it's time we talked about them." The silence in that kitchen was the kind that has teeth. Paul the notary had stopped reaching for his pen. Matthew was staring at the floor like it owed him an answer, and Brooke had that look on her face that I had seen before, the one she used when someone said something she hadn't prepared for. A quick tightening around the eyes, a recalibration happening behind them. "What do you mean?" she said finally. Her voice was even, controlled. She was good, I'll give her that. "I mean exactly what I said." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "There are things about me that you don't know, and I think before Paul here uncaps that pen, we should all be on the same page." Matthew looked up then. "Mom, we just want to help." Matthew. I said his name the way I used to say it when he was 12, and I knew he was lying about where he'd been. Just his name, nothing else. He stopped talking. I looked at Paul. "Are you a licensed notary in the state of Washington?" Paul blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "And did either of these 2 people tell you before you came here what it is you'd be notarizing?" "I was told it was a property transfer consent form." "A consent form," I repeated. I let that land. I watched Matthew's jaw tighten. "That's an interesting way to put it." I leaned back in my chair. "Paul, I'm going to need you to sit tight for a few minutes while I have a conversation with my son and his wife. You're welcome to the coffee if you'd like." Paul looked at Brooke. Brooke gave him the smallest shake of her head. He didn't move toward the coffee. "Suzanne," Brooke said, and the fact that she used my first name instead of calling me nothing at all, she'd always called me nothing, just started talking without any form of address, told me she was shifting tactics, moving from polished dismissal into something that wanted to look like warmth. "We really do have your best interests at heart. The house alone, the upkeep, the property taxes." "I pay my property taxes on time," I said. "Every year, have for 31 years. "Of course you do, but as time goes on—" "Brooke," I kept my voice gentle, "how much do you think this house is worth?" She paused. Again the recalibration. "In this market, probably around 400,000. "That's about right," I said. "It appraised at 390 last fall." I saw her eyes sharpen. She hadn't known I'd had it appraised. "And what do you think I own beyond this house?" The question sat there between us. Matthew shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I could see something working in his face, not suspicion of me, not yet, but something like unease. Like a man who has agreed to a plan and is only now beginning to wonder exactly what the plan is. "Mom," he said carefully, "what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a conversation we should have had a long time ago," I said. "Sit down, Matthew." He sat. Brooke did not. She stayed standing, one hand resting on the back of the chair beside her, and I noticed her fingers were pressing into the wood harder than a relaxed person's fingers press into anything. "When your father died," I said, "Robert Hayes, you remember Robert Carl's lawyer? He called me about 3 weeks after the funeral. He told me something about your grandfather, Earl Whitmore." Matthew frowned. "Grandpa Earl, he died before I was in high school." "He did. But before he died, he left your father something. Something your father paid taxes on every year, but never told me about, not once in our marriage. I don't know if he was waiting for the right moment, or if he thought it wasn't important, or if he simply didn't know how to bring it up. But when Robert called me, he explained what your grandfather had left." I paused. Not for drama, I want you to understand that. I paused because even then, even after 3 years of living with that knowledge, saying it out loud to my son for the first time felt like opening a door I could never close again. "Your father owned 412 acres of farmland in Palouse County," I said, "and when he died, it passed to me." The silence that followed was different from the one before. The first silence had been about strategy. This one was about shock. Real shock, the kind that sits in your body before your brain catches up. Matthew stared at me. "What?" "412 acres, I said again. "I've been paying the taxes and managing the lease agreements through Robert's office for 8 years. How much is it worth?" Matthew asked, and his voice came out younger than he was. He sounded like a boy again. Like the boy who used to ask me questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. I held his gaze. "Robert's most recent appraisal puts it between $11 and $13 million. The color left Matthew's face so fast, it was like watching a light switch off. Brooke made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, sharp and involuntary, quickly suppressed. Her hand came off the back of the chair. She stepped back half a step. Paul, to his credit, had the presence of mind to quietly close his folder. 11 million. Matthew couldn't finish the sentence. "Conservative," I said. "Robert believes there's development potential on the northern ridge that could push it higher, but yes, roughly in that range." Matthew put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. I watched his shoulders rise and fall once hard, like a man trying to surface from deep water. "Mom," he said from behind his hands, "why didn't you ever tell me? And here is where I want you to understand something about me and about that moment, because it is important. I had asked myself that question for 3 years. I had asked it at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I had asked it in the car driving to Robert's office. I had asked it the first Sunday Matthew called, and I thought about saying something and then didn't. Because I wanted to know who my son was," I said, without the money in the room. Matthew lowered his hands. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes in 2 years' real attention, the kind that isn't filtered through someone else's agenda. "And because," I continued, and this time I did look at Brooke, "I wanted to see what happened when people thought I had nothing left to give them except myself." Brooke looked like she'd been slapped, not with a hand, with a fact. "That is," she started. "I'm not finished," I said, quietly, clearly. "The folder that Paul brought today, I'm going to guess it includes a quitclaim deed for this property and possibly a power of attorney form. Am I close?" Paul shifted uncomfortably. Brooke said nothing. "I'm going to tell you both something." I kept my eyes on Brooke. 3 months ago, I updated my will and established a revocable living trust through Robert's office. The ranch is held inside that trust. This house is held inside that trust. Everything I own has been legally protected in a structure that requires multiple steps and specific conditions to alter. Paul's notary stamp on any form I signed today would have had no legal effect on any of it. Robert made sure of that. The air went out of the room. Matthew turned and looked at Brooke. And it was the first time, the absolute first time since that wedding 2 years ago, that I saw him look at her the way you look at someone when you're truly seeing them for the first time. Not with love, not with anger yet, with something more unsettling than either, with uncertainty. "Brooke," he said, "did you know about this, about the ranch?" "Of course not," she said. Her recovery was fast, impressive, actually. She turned to him, and her voice shifted instantly back to the practiced warmth she used on everyone except me. "Matthew, I told you this is about your mother's well-being. You brought a notary to her house unannounced," he said. "You didn't tell me what the form said. I told you it was paperwork to help manage her. You told me it was a care coordination form," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You told me it was something the Senior Services Office recommended. You told me she needed to sign it to access community resources." I watched my son's face as he said those words. I watched the moment he heard himself say them, heard the explanation he'd been given, the one he'd accepted and repeated, and heard how thin it sounded now in a room where the truth had just walked in and taken a seat. "Matthew," I said gently, "what exactly did she tell you this visit was about?" He was quiet for a long moment. "She said you'd been talking to her about feeling overwhelmed, that you'd mentioned wanting to simplify your finances. She said you just needed a push, that you'd never do it on your own, but you'd thank us later." I let him sit with that. I didn't say I never spoke to her about feeling overwhelmed. I didn't say I have not had a real conversation with your wife in 18 months. I didn't say she has never once been in this house without you present until today. I didn't say any of it because I didn't need to. He was already doing the math. I never said that to her. I said simply, I have never said anything like that to her. Matthew stood up. He pushed back from the table and stood up, and I watched something move through his body. Grief, I think. The particular grief of understanding that you have been used by someone you trusted, that your love for your mother was turned into a tool pointed at her. "Paul," he said, his voice entirely different now, flat, tight, controlled. "I think we're done here." Paul had his briefcase closed before Matthew finished the sentence. He was on his feet and moving toward the door with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been in enough family situations to recognize when the exit is the wisest place to be. The front door closed behind him, and then it was just the three of us. Brooke tried once more. I have to hand it to her. She didn't collapse easily. She turned to Matthew with her eyes wide and soft and said, "Matthew, sweetheart, I was trying to protect your mother. I was trying to protect us. Do you have any idea what it would mean for our future if something happened to her and everything was tied up in some trust we have no access to? I did this for us." "Stop." Matthew said it so quietly, it was almost a whisper. But it landed like something much heavier than a whisper. Brooke stopped. "Go wait in the car," he said. I had not heard my son use that voice before. The voice of a man who has hit a wall, found it is made of glass, and is now standing in the shards of everything he thought he was looking at. He said it once. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. Brooke looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her purse from the counter. She had set it there when she came in, the proprietary gesture of someone who walks into a space and immediately claims it, and she walked to the door, her heels on my hardwood floor, the click of the latch behind her. Matthew and I were alone in my kitchen for the first time in 2 years. He stood with his back to me for a moment, facing the window above the sink. I watched his hands. They were hanging at his sides, and I could see them trying not to make fists, trying to keep still the way I had taught him to when he was angry. Breathe first, talk second. When he turned around, his eyes were red at the edges. "Mom," he said, He stopped, started again. "I don't know how much of the last 2 years was me and how much was—" He couldn't finish. "Matthew," I said, "sit down." He sat down in the same chair he'd occupied as a little boy, at the same table eating cereal before school, doing homework, telling me about girls he liked and teachers he feared, and all the enormous ordinary catastrophes of growing up. He sat down and he looked like all of those versions of himself at once, and my heart cracked down the middle the way hearts do not from hate. Never from hate, from love that has been tested so hard it doesn't know its own shape anymore. "I'm not angry at you," I said. "You should be," he said. "Maybe, but I'm not. I'm sad." I folded my hands on the table. "I'm sad because for 2 years I've been losing you. Not to Brooke, to what Brooke needed you to believe about me. That I was fragile, that I was a burden, that the most loving thing you could do for your mother was hand her assets over to the two of you for management." I paused. "Who does that serve, Matthew?" He closed his eyes. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to answer me honestly. Not the way you've been answering me for 2 years, not the way she answers for both of you. I want to hear you." He opened his eyes. "Ask," he said. "Did you love me less these last 2 years? Was it her pushing you away? Or did some part of you want the distance too?" The question hung there between us. I had never asked it before. I had never let myself ask it because I was too afraid of the answer. But I was 69 years old, and I was done being afraid of answers. Matthew's voice when it came was rough. "No," he said. "No, Mom. I always—" He pressed his mouth shut, gathered himself. "She made it feel like love and distance were the same thing, like taking care of you meant stepping back, like being a good husband meant—" He stopped again. "I can see how stupid it sounds when I say it out loud." "It doesn't sound stupid," I said. "It sounds like exactly what she wanted it to sound like. That's how it works, Matthew. That's how someone like that operates. It's gradual. It's patient. And by the time you're standing on your mother's porch with a notary, it feels like the obvious next step." He put his face in his hands again. This time I reached across the table and I put my hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. We sat like that for a while. Outside, I could hear wind moving through the yard. Inside, it was just the two of us, and 38 years of history, and a table we had both sat at through joy and grief, and now this, the complicated, painful, necessary work of being honest. "What happens now?" he finally said. "That depends on what you decide," I told him. "About her, about this marriage, about what you want your life to be." I paused. "I can't make that decision for you. I never could." He nodded slowly. "And the ranch?" "The ranch is mine," I said, clearly but without cruelty. "It will remain mine. What I choose to do with it eventually is in my will, and Robert manages all of it. No one can take it from me, not through a notary at my kitchen table, and not through any other means." I looked at him steadily. "But Matthew, that's not the conversation I want to be having right now. The money is not the point." "I know," he whispered. "The point is that for 2 years, your wife looked me in the eye and worked to erase me from your life, and you let it happen." I kept my voice even. "Not because you're a bad person, but because you loved her and you trusted her more than you trusted your own memory of who I am. And I need you to understand that not as an accusation, as a fact. Because if we are going to find our way back to each other, we have to start with the truth." Matthew looked up at me. His eyes were wet now fully, and he wasn't trying to hide it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I'm so sorry." Something in me released. Not everything there was, still a long road, and I knew it. But something, some small, essential thing. "I know you are," I said, "and that's a start." What I didn't tell Matthew yet, what I was still holding carefully the way you hold something fragile before you've found the right place to set it down, was what Rachel had told me 2 days before when I'd called her the evening after setting up the trust. "Suzanne," Rachel had said, her voice lower than usual, "I need to tell you something. I looked into Brooke. I have a friend in property law, and I asked him to do some checking." A pause. "This isn't the first time she's done this." I had sat very still on the other end of the line. "There was a man in Portland," Rachel said. "Older, Widower. She was with him for 14 months. He signed over his vacation property before his family intervened. They didn't press charges, he was too embarrassed. But there are records, and Suzanne— Another pause. The kind that precedes something that changes everything. The name she used with him wasn't Brooke. The room had shifted around me. Rachel, I said carefully. What was the name she used? And Rachel had told me, and I had written it down on the notepad by the phone and stared at it for a long time. And then I had called Robert Hayes and given him that name. And Robert had called me back 40 minutes later very quietly with news that made everything, all of it, the 2 years the notary the casserole handed back at the door, make a different kind of sense. A darker kind. I was not the first. I would not have been the last. And the woman sitting in my son's car in my driveway was not entirely who she claimed to be. Matthew didn't know any of this yet. There was a time and a place for that conversation, and it was not while his eyes were still red and his hands were still unsteady at my kitchen table. I stood and I put the kettle on. Old habit. The most human thing I knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. "Let me make you some tea," I said. "And then we're going to talk, really talk, the way we used to." Matthew looked at me, this son of mine, this complicated, imperfect, fundamentally good man who had almost lost himself, and he nodded. Behind us in the driveway, the car door opened and closed, and I heard footsteps coming back toward the house. The kettle began to hiss. The footsteps stopped at the door. 3 seconds passed. Then the knock, not hesitant, not polite. 2 sharp raps, the kind that aren't asking permission so much as announcing an intention. Matthew looked at me. I looked at the door. The kettle kept hissing. "Don't," I said quietly. Not to him, to myself. Because every instinct in my body wanted to stand up and answer that door the way I'd answered every door in this house for 31 years, open it wide, step back, let people in. That instinct had served me well with good people and badly with people like Brooke, and I was 69 years old and I was done letting it make decisions for me. Matthew pushed back his chair. "Stay," I said. He looked at me surprised. I shook my head once, and he stayed. Brooke knocked again, harder this time. "Matthew." Her voice through the door, still controlled but thinner now, the polish wearing at the edges. "Matthew, we should go. We can talk about this at home." Matthew said nothing. I watched his hands on the table still, deliberately still. "Matthew?" A pause. "Suzanne." The way she said my name finally after 2 years of saying nothing told me everything about how badly the plan had gone sideways. You don't use someone's name until you need something from them. "I'd really like to come back inside." Matthew looked at me. The question on his face was real. He genuinely didn't know what to do, and I understood that. 2 years of being carefully redirected don't dissolve in 20 minutes. The pathways Brooke had built in his mind were still there. They'd take time to reroute. "She can come in," I said. "But Matthew, I need you to listen, not to her, not to me. I need you to listen to yourself. Whatever she says next, I want you to ask yourself one question: who does this serve?" He nodded slowly. I called out, "It's open." The door opened, and Brooke came back into my kitchen, and the woman who walked in was noticeably different from the one who had walked out 3 minutes before. Not broken. She wasn't the kind of person who broke easily. I understood that now. But reorganized. She had used those 3 minutes in the car to rebuild her approach, and what she'd decided on was softer, more vulnerable. She sat down across from Matthew, and her eyes were bright in a way that might have looked like tears to someone who didn't know her. "I'm sorry," she said. To Matthew, not to me. "I handled this badly. I should have been more transparent with you about what the forms were." She reached across the table for his hand. He let her take it, and I watched his face. He wanted to believe her. Of course he did. That want doesn't die fast. "What were the forms, Brooke?" Matthew asked. "A property management transfer, to put the house in both our names alongside Suzanne's, so that if anything happened to her—" "That's not what a quitclaim deed does," I said pleasantly. She looked at me. The brightness in her eyes went flat for just a moment. "I may have had the wrong paperwork. I'm not a lawyer." "Robert Hayes reviewed the forms Paul brought 2 days ago," I said. Robert had already received a copy. Paul, your notary is also a mortgage broker. Did you know that Matthew? He processes property transfers. That's his business. I looked at Brooke. How do you know Paul? Silence. Brooke. Matthew's voice. How do you know him? He's a professional contact, she said, from work. He processed a property transfer in Portland 14 months ago, I said. Robert found the record. Everything in Brooke's body went very still, the kind of still that isn't calm, the kind that is calculation moving at high speed behind a motionless face. I don't know what you think you know, she said. I think I know about a man named Gerald Ashworth, I said. 67 years old, widower, retired contractor. He owned a vacation cabin on the Clackamas River. Past tense. I let that land. I think I know that you were with him for 14 months under a different name, and I think I know that Paul notarized that transfer. The sound Matthew made was not a word. It was something lower and more involuntary than a word the sound a person makes when the ground disappears. Brooke stood up. Fast. The chair scraped back and she was on her feet, and the mask, the whole careful, constructed 2 years in the making mask, cracked down the middle. What came through wasn't rage. It was something colder than rage. You have no proof of anything, she said. Gerald Ashworth's daughter does, I said. Her name is Patricia. She hired a private investigator 8 months ago when she started asking questions about the transfer. Patricia and I spoke on the phone last Tuesday for 45 minutes. I paused. She's been looking for you, Brooke, or whoever you were when you knew her father. The room was absolutely airless. Matthew was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. I could see the whites of his knuckles. He was staring at Brooke, and she was staring at me, and nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. Matthew, Brooke started. What was the name? He said. His voice was unrecognizable, flat and hollow in a way I had never heard from him. What name were you using? She didn't answer. What was the name, Brooke? This woman is trying to manipulate you, Brooke said, and she turned to him, fully angling her body away from me, trying to collapse the distance between them and shut me out. She's been planning this. She's angry and she's old and she's trying to... Her name was Dana, I said. Dana Kelly. That's what Gerald knew her as. Matthew turned to look at me when I said it, then turned back to Brooke. His mouth was open slightly. He looked like a man in the first seconds after an accident, not hurt, yet not fully just stunned, just trying to understand what had just happened to him. Is that true? He asked her. Did you use another name? It is extremely common in real estate to use a professional name. Dana Kelly is not a professional name, Matthew said. It's a different name, a completely different name. That's not Brooke. That's not what a professional name is. Matthew, listen to me. Did you take his cabin? The question cut through everything. Brooke went quiet. Did you take an old man's cabin? His family was going to contest the estate, she said, and the fact that she answered the fact that she went to justification instead of denial told me she had calculated that denial was no longer viable. She was pivoting, regrouping, moving to the next line of defense. He wanted to leave it to me. He told me, I don't want to hear it. Matthew stood up. He was taller than her by several inches, and he stood up to his full height, and something in his face had finished shifting, finished moving from confusion to understanding, and the understanding was not kind. I don't want to hear the explanation. Matthew, how much of what you've told me is real? His voice broke on the last word. Our whole, everything we built. He stopped, drew a breath. Was any of it true? Brooke looked at him for a long moment, and I watched her make a decision. I watched her decide in real time that softness was no longer her best option, that the performance was over, and the question now was damage control. I love you, she said. That's real. That's not enough of an answer, he said. My phone buzzed on the counter. I had been expecting it. I picked it up, looked at the screen, and said, Robert is outside. Both of them looked at me. I asked him to come by this morning, I said. I wanted him here in case things needed to be formalized. I looked at Brooke directly. Patricia Ashworth's investigator has filed a complaint with the Washington State Attorney General's office. Robert has been in contact with them. There's a woman from the prosecutor's Consumer Protection Division who has been looking at a pattern of elder financial exploitation across 3 states. She's been looking for a case with enough documentation to move forward. I kept my voice level. Even. Brooke, I have been cooperating with that investigation for 6 weeks. The color in Brooke's face didn't drain the way Matthew's had. It did something different. It went hard, like something behind the skin had solidified. You've been 6 weeks, I said, since Robert gave me Patricia Ashworth's contact information. You have nothing, she said, but there was no conviction in it anymore. It was reflex, the last line before the retreat. Patricia has Gerald's journals, I said. He kept a journal every day for 40 years. Dana features prominently in the last 14 months of entries. I paused. Paul Thompson, your notary, has had his license reviewed twice in the last 4 years. He's cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced finding. Another pause. And Robert has documented every contact Brooke made with his office over the past 8 months, attempting to determine the scope of my estate. She called 3 times. Twice from her personal number, once from a number registered to a property management company in Bellevue that, as far as Robert can determine, does not actually conduct any property management business. Brooke sat back down, slowly, like her legs had decided before the rest of her. Matthew was looking at her the way you look at a stranger, not with hatred, with the specific bewilderment of realizing you do not know the person you have been sleeping next to, eating with, building a life with. That the person you thought you were marrying was a careful construction, and you were never going to be allowed to see what was underneath it. I want a lawyer, Brooke said, quietly, almost to herself. That would be my recommendation, I said. Robert came in. Then he had a key. I had given it to him 2 weeks ago precisely for a moment like this, and he came into my kitchen with his leather folder under his arm and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at the 3 of us, and he assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, with the calm efficiency of a man who has been doing this for 40 years. Matthew, he said, extending his hand. I'm Robert Hayes. I handled your father's estate, and I handle your mother's affairs. I'm glad you're here. There are some things you should know. Matthew shook his hand like a man in a dream. Yeah, he said. Apparently there are. Robert sat down. He opened his folder. He was precise and methodical, and he did not editorialize. He simply laid out what he knew. The trust structure, the protections, the cooperation with the Attorney General's office, the documentation of the contacts Brooke had made with his office. He spoke for about 12 minutes, and when he was done, the kitchen was very quiet. Brooke had not spoken once during those 12 minutes. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes focused on some middle distance, and she was doing what she did best, thinking, calculating, finding the angle. I watched her, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something more complicated and more tired than either of those things. Something that felt almost like pity, not for what was happening to her now, but for whatever had happened to her before. To make her this. To teach her that people were resources to be harvested. Nobody learns that from nothing. Somewhere a long time ago, something had made Brooke believe that the only way to survive was to take before you could be taken from. I didn't excuse her, but I understood in that moment that she was as trapped as anyone she had ever targeted. Just trapped differently. Where does this go? Matthew asked Robert. He was asking about Brooke. He meant legally. What happens now? That will depend on the pace of the Attorney General's investigation and whether Ms. Robert glanced at his folder. Whether Brooke chooses to cooperate fully. He kept his voice neutral, professional. At minimum, Gerald Ashworth's family has grounds for a civil suit. Whether criminal charges follow will depend on the evidence standard the prosecutor's office determines is met. He closed the folder. What I can tell you with certainty is that your mother is fully protected. The trust is airtight. Nothing that happened today, or could have happened today, would have altered her position. Matthew nodded. He was holding it together. I could see the effort it was costing him, could see the fine tremor in his jaw that he'd had since he was a little boy when he was trying not to cry. He had his father's way of carrying hard things, quietly, straight spine, tremble only in the small places. "I need some air," he said. He touched my shoulder briefly with one hand as he passed, just a touch, just his fingers on my shoulder. But it was the most contact we'd had in 2 years, and it moved through me like electricity, and he went out the back door into the yard. Brooke and I were alone. Robert was there, but he understood somehow that this moment belonged to the two of us, and he turned his attention to his folder with the discretion of a man who knows when to become invisible. "You planned all of this," Brooke said. Not an accusation, just a statement, something almost like acknowledgement. "I prepared," I said. "That's different." She looked at me, for the first time without strategy behind her eyes. She was exhausted, I realized, the kind of exhausted that lives in someone who has been performing for so long they've forgotten what it would feel like to stop. "How long did you know?" she asked. "I suspected something was wrong within 6 months of your wedding," I said. "I knew something was specifically wrong about a year ago. I knew about Gerald 8 weeks ago." She absorbed that. "And you still let it play out?" "I needed everything documented," I said, "and I needed Matthew to see it himself. If I had come to him with accusations, he would have defended me," she said, flat, certain. "Yes," I said, "he would have." Something moved across her face, almost something human. "I didn't plan to hurt him," she said. "I believe you," I said, and I did. Not because it absolved her, it didn't, but because I think for Brooke, people like Matthew were simply weather, present or not present, not quite real enough to be intentionally hurt. That was its own kind of damage, but it was different from malice. "What happens to me now?" she asked. "That's not my decision," I said. "That's the Attorney General's decision, and eventually Matthew's." I folded my hands. "What I can tell you is that my job here protecting myself, protecting my son from further manipulation, cooperating with the people who are trying to make sure you don't do this to another woman my age, my job is done." I looked at her steadily. "What you do next is entirely up to you." She looked at her hands. Then she picked up her purse. She stood. She smoothed her blazer in that precise automatic way she had the gesture so trained it operated even now, even here at the end of everything. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. I thought she might say something final, something that would close the story neatly. But she didn't. She just went. The door closed quietly behind her. No drama, no last line, just gone. Robert let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said. "Yes," I agreed. Through the back door, I could hear Matthew in the yard. I could hear him, not words, not crying, just the sound of boots moving slowly through dry grass. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a man trying to figure out what he's standing on now, that the thing he thought was solid has turned out to be nothing. I knew that sound because I had made it myself 8 years ago, standing beside Carl's grave in October. I poured 2 cups of tea. I carried one out the back door into the yard. Matthew was standing near the old fence at the back of the property, his arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. I walked over and stood beside him and held out the cup. He took it. We stood there together for a while without speaking, the way we used to sometimes when he was a teenager and something had gone wrong and the talking could wait, but the standing together couldn't. "Dad would have liked Robert," Matthew said finally. "He did like Robert," I said. "They golfed together twice a year." A small broken sound came out of Matthew that was half laugh and half something else. "Of course they did." I sipped my tea. He sipped his. The wind moved through the yard the way it always did in March, restless, not quite decided about whether winter was over. "The ranch," Matthew said. "Tell me about it." So I did. I told him about the call from Robert after Carl's funeral, about the drive I'd taken out to Palouse County the following spring alone to stand on the land for the first time and try to understand what it meant, about the wheat fields leased to the neighboring operation and the ridge to the north where Robert's surveyor believed the real potential lay, About the farmhouse at the center of the property that was old and needed work, and had a porch that faced west, and a view of rolling hills that Carl had apparently stood on as a young man without ever telling me about it. Matthew listened. He asked questions, good questions, real questions, the questions of a son, and not of someone assessing an inheritance. And I answered all of them, holding nothing back this time, because the time for holding things back was over. "Why did Dad never tell you?" he asked. "I've thought about that for 3 years," I said. My best guess. He didn't know how to make it feel real. We were always practical people. $1 million worth of land in a county we'd never lived in felt like something that might disappear if you looked at it directly. I paused. Or maybe he was waiting for the right moment and ran out of time. That happens to people, Matthew. They wait for the right moment and it doesn't come, and then it's too late. I looked at him. I don't want to wait for the right moment anymore. He nodded. His jaw had stopped trembling. His eyes were dry now. He was finding his feet. I could see it happening, the slow, necessary work of a person locating themselves after the ground has shifted. "I want to see it," he said. "The ranch. Will you take me?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "Yes, I will." He turned and looked at me fully, then the way he hadn't in 2 years, the way I had missed so much it had started to feel like a physical absence. My son, looking at his mother, really seeing her. "I'm going to fix this," he said. "I don't know how long it takes, but I'm going to fix it." "I know," I said, and I did know. Not because fixing it was simple or fast or guaranteed, but because I had raised this man. I had sat with him through every version of hard, and I knew what he was made of underneath everything that had been built up around him over the past 2 years. He was made of the same thing his father was made of, the same thing I was made of. Ordinary stubbornness, ordinary love, the kind that bends and doesn't break. Behind us through the house I heard the front door open. Then Robert's voice, and another voice I recognized, a woman's voice, measured and professional. The investigator from the prosecutor's office had arrived. I set down my teacup. I straightened my back. I looked at my son and said, "Ready?" He took one more breath, set his own cup down on the fence post beside him. "Ready," he said. And we walked back into the house together. Her name was Agent Linda Marsh, and she was the kind of woman who made you feel the moment she walked into a room that everything was about to become very organized and very serious. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that missed nothing and apologized for nothing. She shook my hand first, then Matthew's, then Robert's, and she did it in that order deliberately. I was the client, the protected party, the reason she was here. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "thank you for your cooperation over the past 6 weeks. I know this has been a difficult process." "Less difficult than the alternative," I said. Something in her face acknowledged that without quite becoming a smile. She sat down, set a leather portfolio on the table, and looked at Matthew with the frank, assessing gaze of someone whose job required reading people quickly and accurately. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I understand this is a lot to take in. Are you all right to proceed?" Matthew had his hands flat on the table. He nodded once. "Tell me what I don't know," he said. "That's exactly what I intend to do," she said. She opened the portfolio. She laid 3 photographs on the table. Matthew looked at them and went very still. They were photographs of Brooke, but not Brooke as he knew her. Different hair, different context, same unmistakable face. One at what appeared to be a county courthouse. One outside an assisted living facility, one at a restaurant with an older man who was not Matthew. "Gerald Ashworth," Linda said, touching the 3rd photograph. 67, Portland, Oregon. He met the woman you know as Brooke in the spring of 2021. He knew her as Dana Kelly. 14 months later, he signed over his vacation property on the Clackamas River. Market value at the time, $480,000. She paused. His daughter Patricia contacted my office 7 months ago. Matthew picked up the photograph. He looked at it the way you look at something that hurts steady, because looking away doesn't make it stop hurting. "What's her real name?" he asked. We believe it is Rebecca Sowers, Linda said. Born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1983, one prior identity we've confirmed, Dana Kelly. Your wife, Brooke, may be a third identity, though the marriage is legally registered under Brooke Caldwell, which may itself be assumed. She looked at him evenly. We're still working on the documentation. The word came out of Matthew before he could stop it. She's not my wife, he said. And then he stopped hearing himself. Because legally, she was. And everything that word meant, everything he had built his life around for 2 years, was sitting in that sentence like a splinter. Matthew, I said quietly. He set the photograph down, pressed his hands flat on the table again. Keep going, he said to Linda. The pattern is consistent, she said. She identifies widowed or recently bereaved older individuals with assets. She establishes a relationship over a period of months or years. She moves toward a transfer property accounts or both and then exits. In Gerald Ashworth's case, she was gone within 3 weeks of the transfer. Linda turned a page. We believe there may be a 4th case in Nevada, but the individual involved has declined to cooperate. That happens. People are embarrassed. They feel foolish. They don't want to stand up in a courtroom and explain how they were deceived. She targeted my mother, Matthew said. The words came out measured and deliberate, like he was placing them somewhere specific. She married me specifically to get close to my mother. That appears to be the case, yes, Linda said. Your mother's home was the initial target. She likely did not know about the ranch initially. Our belief is that she made inquiries at Robert's office, which Robert documented and reported because she suspected there might be more. The ranch exceeded anything she had previously attempted. That scale may be why she moved faster than usual and less carefully. Less carefully, Matthew repeated. She brought a notary to the house. She got impatient, Linda said. That's not uncommon when the target is more resistant than anticipated. She glanced at me. Your mother was significantly more resistant than anyone she had previously encountered. Matthew looked at me. Something in his expression shifted not to relief, not yet, but towards something like recognition, like he was seeing fully for the first time exactly who had been sitting in front of him his entire life. Yeah, he said softly. She is. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I had done my crying privately in the months before this day, in the middle of nights when the house was quiet, and the weight of everything was heaviest. I had sat with Rachel on the phone, and I had let it out. Then the hurt of being pushed out of my son's life, the grief of watching him become someone I didn't recognize, the fear underneath all the preparation. I had done all of that where it belonged in private with someone I trusted. By the time this day came, I had already moved through most of it. What I felt sitting at that table was something cleaner, something close to resolve. What happens now? I asked Linda. She'll know we're moving, Linda said. If she's smart, and she is, she won't wait around. There's a real possibility she leaves the state quickly. She looked at Matthew. I want to ask you directly, Mr. Whitmore. Do you know where she might go? Does she have family, close friends? Anyone she would contact in a situation like this? Matthew shook his head slowly. She told me she grew up in Reno. Her parents were dead. She said she had a sister she wasn't close to. She didn't have many friends. We mostly saw her colleagues, people from her office. He paused. I never met anyone she was actually close to. Now I understand why. The Reno family background is likely fabricated, Linda said, not unkindly. What about the colleagues? Was there anyone you saw her communicate with regularly outside of work functions? Matthew thought. There was a woman she texted sometimes. I never met her. She just called her a friend from college. He paused. I asked about her once, and Brooke changed the subject. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Linda wrote something down. Any name, just a contact name in her phone. K. He frowned. Just the letter K. Linda wrote that too. That may be nothing. It may not be. She closed the portfolio. What I can tell you is that as of this morning, there is an official case open with the Washington State Attorney General's office and a parallel inquiry with Oregon. If she attempts to leave the country, there are mechanisms available to us through the Financial Fraud Division. She looked at Matthew steadily. I want to be honest with you about something. We may not recover Gerald Ashworth's property. The transfer was legally executed, and he has been reluctant to testify. The criminal case depends heavily on a pattern of behavior rather than a single incident, which is why your mother's cooperation and documentation have been so valuable. She paused. This is how these cases work. We build them slowly, and we need people like your mother who are willing to do the difficult thing for the long time it takes. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What can I do?" Linda looked at him carefully. "Are you willing to make a statement about your marriage, the approach she took the visit today?" "Yes," he said, without hesitating, without looking at me for confirmation. Just yes, immediate clean the answer of a man who had made a decision somewhere between the backyard and this chair. "Matthew," I said, not to stop him, just so he'd look at me. He looked at me. "Are you sure?" I asked. "This is your marriage. This is your life." "My marriage is a crime scene, Mom," he said. The words were brutal, but his voice wasn't. His voice was just tired and honest. "And whatever my life is from here, I want to build it on something real." He held my gaze. "I want to start that today." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice enough to do anything more than that. Linda walked Matthew through the statement process, and Robert sat beside him the way a good lawyer sits present protective, ready to intervene if anything stepped outside of what was appropriate. I excused myself to the kitchen, not to fall apart, just to give them the space to work and to give myself 5 minutes to be alone with everything that was moving through me. I stood at the counter and I thought about Carl. I thought about him the way I often do when something important happens, as though I'm reporting in. "Carl, I thought your son is in there doing the right thing. Your land is safe. Everything you left behind is still standing." I could almost hear him saying, "I know you'd handle it, Suzanne. I always knew." My phone buzzed. Rachel. "Well," she said before I could speak. "Tell me everything." "She's gone," I said. "Linda Marsh is here. Matthew gave a statement. Robert has everything documented." A pause. "Rachel," she had another name. 2 other names, actually. A sharp intake of breath. "Lord." "Gerald Ashworth's daughter was right about everything," I said. "Linda thinks there may be a 4th victim in Nevada." "A 4th? Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Suzanne, do you understand what you've done? Do you actually understand it?" "I kept my house," I said. "You stopped her," Rachel said. "Not just from you, from whoever came next. Some other woman sitting alone in her kitchen with no idea what was about to walk through her door." Her voice was fierce with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pride. "You stopped the whole chain." I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms. I stood in my kitchen and I let that settle into me, the weight of it and the warmth of it. The idea that the thing I had spent 6 months preparing to protect myself had ended up protecting someone I would never meet. "How's Matthew?" Rachel asked softer. "He's finding his way," I said. "He's going to be okay." "Of course he is," she said. "He has you." When I went back into the living room, Linda was packing up her portfolio and Robert was shaking Matthew's hand. Matthew looked hollowed out in the way that sometimes follows doing something very hard, not empty, but lighter. Like setting down something heavy you've been carrying for a long time without realizing it. Linda stopped at the door. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I want to say something off the record." She waited until I nodded. "In 6 weeks of working with you, I have not once had to ask you for the same document twice. You anticipated everything we needed. You were organized, patient, and frankly more prepared than most of the attorneys I work with." The almost smile again. "Whatever you did before you retired, they were lucky to have you." "I raised a son," I said, "and I was married for 32 years to a man who made me feel capable of anything." I looked at her steadily. "That turns out to be adequate preparation for most things." She nodded once, and then she left. Robert stayed another half hour. There were documents for Matthew to review, not legal obligations, but informational things Robert thought he should understand. The structure of the trust, what it meant, what was protected, and why. I sat beside Matthew while Robert explained it, and I watched my son absorb information that should have reached him years ago, in a different context, under better circumstances. I thought, this is late. but late is not the same as never. After Robert left, Matthew and I sat together in the living room. The afternoon had moved on while we weren't watching. The quality of light had shifted softer, now the particular gold of a March afternoon, deciding to be generous. "I need to go to the apartment," he said eventually. "She may or may not be there, but I need to assess what she's taken already." He said it matter-of-factly, practically, and I realized he had already thought through several steps ahead. He was his father's son in that. Carl always processed grief sideways through logistics. "Do you want me to come?" I asked. He considered it. "No," he said. "I think this part I need to do alone." He paused. "But I want to come back tonight if that's okay. I don't want to be in that apartment after I don't want to be there tonight." "Your room is exactly as it was," I said. "Your father never let me change it." Something crossed his face that was too layered to name. "Of course he didn't," he said. "He left around 3. I watched him pull out of the driveway, and I stood at the window for a moment after his car was gone, and I let myself feel all of it, everything I had kept organized and purposeful and forward-facing for 6 months, the loneliness of the last 2 years, the particular pain of watching your child be used as a weapon against you, the fear that lived under all the preparation, the fear I had never fully named that, even if I protected everything else, I might lose Matthew permanently, that Brooke might have gone deep enough that the damage was structural. I stood at the window and I let myself feel it, and then I let it go. Not completely, you don't let that kind of thing go completely in an afternoon, but enough to breathe. Then I did what I always did when the work of a hard day was over. I called Rachel. "He's coming back tonight," I told her. "Good," she said, firm and warm at once. "That's where he belongs." "Rachel," I hesitated. "She's going to run. Linda thinks so. She might already be gone." "Let her run," Rachel said. "You've given Linda everything she needs. That's not your job anymore, Suzanne. Your job was to protect yourself and your son. You did that." "What if she finds another target before they catch her?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Then Linda will find that person too, and your documentation will still be what built the case." She paused. "You can't carry the weight of everything she might do. You can only do what you did. And what you did was enough. More than enough." I knew Rachel was right. I also knew, in the way you know things that sit in the body rather than the mind, that the feeling of enough would take longer to arrive than the fact of it. That's how it works. The fact comes first. The feeling follows when it's ready. The call I didn't expect came at 4:17. It was Matthew. He had been at the apartment for 40 minutes. "Mom." His voice was strange, controlled in that way that is very close to the edge of not being controlled. I gripped the phone. "What is it?" "She's been here," he said. "She came back before I got here. She took her clothes, some jewelry, the laptop." A pause. "She left the ring on the kitchen counter." Another pause, briefer. "There's a folder on the counter under the ring, printed emails between her and someone named Kay." His voice shifted. "Mom, she was planning this before we were even engaged. There are emails from before I proposed to her. She knew about the house. She'd looked up your address. She'd looked up property records." A long silence. "She had a timeline. There's a document on the printer. She must have printed it this morning before we came to your house. It's a timeline for completing the transfer of your property within 90 days. I sat down. I hadn't realized I was standing. 90 days, I said. "She had exit dates planned," he said. His voice cracked on the last word and held. "Exit dates, Mom. Like a project plan, like we were a project she was managing." I could hear him trying to breathe steadily. I was in it. I was one of the line items. Maintain Matthew's confidence. That's literally what it says. Maintain Matthew's confidence. Scheduled for review quarterly. I closed my eyes. "Matthew," I said, "I'm so sorry. I keep trying to—" He stopped. Started again. "I keep trying to find the thing that was real, some part of it, and I know I loved her. That part was real on my end, but what was real on hers—" His voice was very quiet now. "Was there a single moment in 2 years that wasn't calculated?" I didn't have an answer that would make that easier, so I didn't pretend I did. I don't know, I said honestly. I truly don't know. But I know the way you loved her was real. The capacity in you that she took advantage of is not a flaw, Matthew. It's the best part of who you are. She found it, and she used it. That says everything about her, and nothing about you. He didn't respond for a moment. I could hear him breathing. Then, I'm calling Linda. Good, I said. The folder will be evidence. Yes. I'll be there by 6, he said. I'll have dinner on the table by 6:30, I said. Your father's pot roast. A sound from him that started as something painful and arrived somewhere close to a laugh. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. The folder Matthew brought to Linda that evening contained, as it turned out, more than the timeline. There were emails going back 27 months, conversations with Kay, who Linda would later identify as a woman who had served as Brooks' logistical contact across multiple operations, that laid out the entire strategy in the kind of detail that investigators dream about finding and almost never do. It was the kind of evidence that doesn't just build a case, it anchors one. Linda called me the following morning, and she used the almost smile I'd heard by then. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I'll be honest with you. In 12 years of this work, I have rarely seen a case this well documented fall into place this completely. A pause. How much of that was luck, and how much was planning? Mostly planning, I said, with some luck. The folder Matthew found, that was luck. That was Brooke getting careless, I said. Which was inevitable. People like her get careless eventually. They believe their own performance too much. They start to feel invincible. I paused. She made the same mistake she thought I was making. She underestimated who she was dealing with. Indeed she did, Linda said. They found her 2 days later, not in Washington. She had driven to Portland the evening of the confrontation at my house, the same city where Gerald Ashworth was still living, trying to piece together what had happened to his cabin. She had stayed one night in a hotel under a name that wasn't hers, and wasn't Dana Kelly, and wasn't Brooke Caldwell, which told the investigators they had at least a fourth identity to untangle. In the morning, she drove south. She made it as far as Sacramento before the flag on her financial activity triggered an alert that Linda's office had been waiting for. She was detained at a gas station off I-5. She did not resist. She made one phone call which went unanswered. The contact name in the log was Kay. Matthew was sitting at my kitchen table when I got the call from Linda. I was standing at the stove. I turned and looked at him, and he read my face before I said a word. They got her, he said. Not a question. Sacramento, I said. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, they were clear. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. The word of a man releasing something he'd been holding with both hands. I went back to the stove. Matthew picked up his coffee. The house was warm. Outside, the wind had finally settled into something that felt less like winter fighting and more like spring arriving. And we sat together in the ordinary, irreplaceable quiet of a mother and her son, and for the first time in 2 years, it felt exactly like what it was. Home. The weeks after Brooks' detention moved the way weeks do after a crisis, faster than you expect. And stranger. There's a particular disorientation that comes after you've been braced for something for a long time, and then it's over. Your body doesn't believe it immediately. You keep waiting for the next thing to go wrong. You keep checking the locks on doors that nobody is trying to open anymore. Matthew stayed in his old room for 11 days. He didn't ask. I didn't offer. He just stayed, and I let him. And we moved around each other in the house the way we had when he was in high school, quietly, companionably, each of us doing our own thinking, but doing it in the same space. Some mornings he made the coffee before I was up. Some evenings I made dinner, and he washed dishes without being asked. Carl used to say that the truest test of how well you know someone is whether you can be in a room with them without having to fill the silence. By that measure, Matthew and I passed every morning of those 11 days. He talked to a lawyer about the marriage, not Robert. Robert was mine, but a family attorney named Carol Simons, who Linda's office recommended. Carol was matter-of-fact and efficient, and she told Matthew plainly that the marriage was likely voidable on the grounds of fraud, that the process would take time, that he should expect it to be uncomfortable and then to be over. Matthew thanked her, wrote down everything she said, and came home and told me about the conversation at the kitchen table with the same flat practicality he'd used when he said, "She's not my wife." He was processing it the only way he knew how, one factual step at a time, moving forward, because forward was the only direction that made sense. What he didn't talk about, not directly, was the grief. The real grief. Not the anger, not the sense of betrayal those he could name. The grief was harder to get hold of. It was the grief of a man who had loved someone genuinely and completely, and was now standing in the ruins of that and trying to understand whether love given to a lie is still real love, or just a very convincing feeling pointed in the wrong direction. I had watched him wrestling with it at the edges of conversations, in the pauses between sentences, in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of doing something ordinary and just stood there for a moment with a look on his face that belonged to a man much older than 41. On the 9th night, I knocked on his door. "Come in," he said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed looking at his phone, not scrolling, just holding it. I sat down in the desk chair across from him, the same chair I used to sit in when he was 15, and we needed to have the conversations that couldn't happen across a dinner table. "Talk to me," I said. He looked up. "About what?" "About whatever it is you've been carrying by yourself for 9 days. He put the phone down. He looked at his hands. "I feel stupid," he said. "That's the part I can't get past. Not the anger, not even the sadness. Just, I feel stupid. How did I not see it? How did I sit next to her for 2 years and not see it? Because she was very good at what she did," I said, "and because you loved her. Those two things together make a wall that's almost impossible to see through from the inside." "You saw it," he said, not accusatory, just honest. "I was on the outside," I said, "and I was afraid. Fear makes you pay attention in a different way than love does." I paused. "And I had Robert and Rachel in time. You had none of those things working for you." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever doubt yourself? When you were building the case, preparing everything, did you ever think maybe you were wrong about her?" "Every single week," I said. "Every week I thought, what if Rachel is wrong? What if I'm a bitter old woman manufacturing reasons to dislike my son's wife?" I held his gaze. That doubt was the hardest part. Harder than the logistics, harder than the loneliness, because I loved you, and I was doing something that if I was wrong would have hurt you terribly. Matthew looked at me with those eyes, Carl's eyes, same deep set, same way of going very still when something mattered. "But you kept going." "I kept going," I said, "because the alternative was doing nothing. And doing nothing is a choice, too. It just doesn't feel like one." He nodded slowly. "Then, she put me in a document, Mom. A project management document." He shook his head. "Maintain Matthew's confidence. Quarterly review." He said it like he was still trying to make the words mean something he could hold. I keep thinking, was every conversation planned? Every fight, did she decide when to be cold and when to be warm based on what served the timeline? "Probably," I said, gently but honestly. "Yes, probably." "Then what was I to her?" I took a breath. "You were the mechanism," I said. "The key that opened the door. That doesn't diminish what you felt. It doesn't diminish who you are. It means she saw something in you, your loyalty, your love for me, your fundamental decency, and she used it. People who operate the way she operated don't choose their targets at random. They choose people who have real love in them because real love is what's most useful." I paused. What she found in you was real. She just didn't have the capacity to value it. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I missed you, Mom. These last 2 years. I want you to know that. Even when I was doing what she needed me to do, I missed you. Every Sunday call that got shorter, every dinner that got canceled. I felt it. I just didn't know what to do with it." Something in my chest unlocked, something I had been guarding for 2 years without fully realizing it. "I know," I said. "I know you did." "I'm sorry," he said, for the second time. But this time it landed differently. This time it wasn't the apology of a man in shock. It was the apology of a man who had sat with the full weight of what he was sorry for and decided to carry it honestly. "I should have trusted you more than I trusted her. I should have—" "Matthew!" I leaned forward. "Stop. You don't owe me a verdict on yourself. You owe me your presence, that's all. Just be here. Going forward, be here." He looked at me for a moment. Then he stood up and crossed the room, and he put his arms around me the way he used to when he was small enough that his whole head fit under my chin, and I held my son in his childhood bedroom, and outside the wind was doing something quiet in the eaves. And I thought this was worth all of it. Every document, every late night, every moment of doubt. This exact moment. He left on the 12th day, back to the apartment to begin sorting through what remained of a life he was dismantling and rebuilding simultaneously. He called me that evening. The Sunday calls had started again, not monthly, not bi-weekly. Every Sunday. Every single Sunday at 10 in the morning, the same as when he was in college, and we were just learning to love each other across a distance. It was Rachel who brought up the next thing. Rachel always brings up the next thing. We were having lunch at her kitchen table 3 weeks after Brooke's detention, and she was refilling my coffee, and she said without preamble, the way Rachel says things, "What are you going to do with the ranch?" I had been waiting for someone to ask me that. "I've been thinking about it," I said. "And I drove out there last week," I said, "by myself. I needed to stand on it again." Rachel sat down across from me. "And," she said again. "It's extraordinary," I said. "The land, the space, the quiet of it." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup. Carl stood there as a young man and never told me. I've been trying to understand that for 3 years. But last week, standing there, I finally stopped trying to understand it and just accepted it. He left it for me. Whatever his reasons for keeping it, he made sure it came to me. That's what I know. "So, what are you going to do with it?" I looked at her. "I want to build something there," I said. "Not develop it. Not sell it. Build something on it." I paused. "You know how Linda said the hardest part of these cases is that victims don't come forward, that they're too embarrassed, too isolated, too afraid." Rachel went still, the way she goes still when she realizes something is coming that matters. "There are women out there right now," I said, "in the same position I was in, older, alone. Someone has been working on them for months, maybe years, moving them slowly toward a signature or a phone call or a document that will take everything they have, and they don't know it yet. Or they suspect it, but they don't have a Robert Hayes, they don't have a Rachel." I set down my cup. "I want to change that." Rachel stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me exactly what you're thinking." What I was thinking had been forming for weeks, since Linda's call, since the morning Matthew sat at my table, and I watched him understand what had been done to him and through him. I had been thinking about the women I didn't know, the Gerald Ashworths I would never meet, the ones who didn't have a friend like Rachel to sound the alarm, or a lawyer like Robert to build the walls, or the particular stubbornness that had been either my greatest character flaw or my greatest asset, depending on who you asked. I told Rachel, all of it. She asked questions practical sharp, the questions of a woman who is organized enough in her life to know that good intentions without structure become nothing. By the end of lunch, we had the beginning of something that looked very roughly like a plan. The twist came from Robert 6 weeks later. I was in his office for a routine trust review when he looked up from his papers and said in the careful voice he used when something required careful handling, "Suzanne, I've been contacted by a journalist." I looked at him. "What kind of journalist?" "Investigative. She works for a regional outlet, but she has a national readership online. She's been tracking elder financial exploitation in the Pacific Northwest for 18 months. She found the case through the Attorney General's office." He paused. "She knows about the ranch. She knows about Gerald Ashworth. She knows about you." Another pause. "She wants to write about what you did. The preparation, the trust structure, the cooperation with Linda's office. She believes, and I think she's right, that your case is the most completely documented example of this type of fraud that has ever reached this stage in Washington state. I sat back. She wants to write about me. She wants to write about what's possible, Robert said. When someone knows what they have and refuses to be moved. He looked at me over his reading glasses. There are women reading her articles right now, Suzanne. Women in exactly your position 18 months ago. If they read your story, they'd know what to look for, I said. They'd know it's possible to fight back, he said. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I called the journalist. Her name was Angela Reyes, and she was 34, and she had the particular intensity of someone who has spent years watching a problem that most people ignore. We talked for 2 hours. She asked good questions. She listened the way people listen when they're genuinely trying to understand, rather than just gather material. At the end of the call, she said, "Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead," I said. "Were you scared?" I thought about it honestly. "Every day," I said. From the moment I understood what was happening, I was scared. Not of her, not exactly. Scared of being wrong. Scared of losing Matthew permanently. Scared that doing the right thing and doing it carefully would still not be enough. I paused. But I was more scared of the alternative, of just letting it happen, of sitting in my house in 5 years with nothing left and knowing I had seen it coming and not moved. Angela was quiet for a moment. "That's the part I want people to read," she said. "That's the part that might actually help someone." The article ran 8 weeks later. I won't tell you it was comfortable to read. Seeing your own story, laid out in someone else's words, the details of 2 years of manipulation, the notary at the kitchen table, the document with my son scheduled for quarterly review, is not comfortable. But Angela had done what she said she would do. She had written it not as a cautionary tale, but as a demonstration of what was possible, what was survivable, what a woman of 69 alone in a 3-bedroom house in Spokane could do when she refused to believe that powerless was the only option. The response was not what I expected. I had expected maybe a few emails, some comments online. What I got was 312 messages in the first week. Women from Oregon and Idaho and Montana and as far east as Ohio. Some of them were in the middle of what I had been in the middle of. Some of them had already lost things and wanted to know if they could still fight. Some of them were daughters worried about their mothers. Some of them were just women who had read the article and felt for the first time that someone had named something they had been living with and not known how to call by its right name. I read every single one. I answered as many as I could. Rachel answered the rest. And that was how on a Thursday morning in early October, I drove out to the ranch for the 3rd time since Carl died, but the first time with Matthew sitting in the passenger seat beside me. He was quiet most of the drive. Good quiet. The quiet of someone taking something in. When we pulled up the long gravel drive toward the old farmhouse, he leaned forward and looked through the windshield at the rolling hills, stretching out in every direction, gold and amber in the fall light, vast and unhurried, and entirely ours. "Dad stood here," he said softly. "When he was about your age," I said. Matthew was quiet for another moment. Then, "He should have told you." "He should have," I said, "but he didn't. And here we are." Matthew looked at me sideways. "What does that mean? Here we are?" "It means," I said, "that I'm going to restore the farmhouse. Robert has a contractor coming next month. I'm going to hold a workshop here in the spring. Women who have read Angela's article who need someone to walk them through what I did, how to set up protection before they need it, how to recognize the early signs, how to find the Roberts and the Rachels in their own lives." I looked out at the land. This place was just sitting here for 8 years with no purpose except being an asset on a balance sheet. Carl didn't know what to do with it. I do. Matthew looked at the farmhouse, at the land, at me. "You're going to turn it into a resource," he said. Not a question. More like someone watching a thing become what it was always meant to be and naming it as it arrives. "I'm going to turn it into a place where women come and leave less alone than they arrived," I said, "and less afraid." He reached over and put his hand over mine on the gear shift. Just his hand over mine, the way Carl used to. "I want to help," he said. "If you'll let me." "Of course I'll let you," I said. "You're the one who's going to fix the porch." He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first laugh I had heard from him in 2 years that didn't have anything careful wrapped around it. It filled the car, and I held on to the sound of it. Linda called in November with the update I had been waiting for. Rebecca Sowers, the real name, the Tulsa name, the name that existed before Dana Kelly and before Brooke Caldwell, had agreed to a plea arrangement. The terms were not lenient. Restitution to Gerald Ashworth's family. A sentence that Linda described as meaningful in the quiet way she described things she was satisfied with. The Nevada victim, Linda told me, had ultimately come forward after Angela's article ran. She was 64. She had almost lost a home she had owned for 30 years. She had read the piece on a Thursday afternoon and called Linda's office on Friday morning. "She said reading about you made her feel less foolish," Linda told me. I thought about that for a long time after the call. The idea that my story, my particular stubbornness, my particular fear, the 6 months I spent building walls while trying to look like I wasn't, could make someone else feel less foolish, less alone, less like the thing that had happened to them was a reflection of their worth rather than a demonstration of someone else's calculation. Matthew came for Thanksgiving. He brought Carol Simon's paperwork, the marriage dissolution nearly finalized clean and clear, and legally closing a door that had been open in the wrong direction for 2 years. We didn't talk about it much. We made pie. We called Rachel. We called Robert, who spent the holidays with a daughter in Boise, but answered the phone on the second ring and told me in his careful, measured way that he was glad things had turned out as they had. "They turned out because you built them this way," I told him. "We built them this way," he said. "You and I. Don't shortchange yourself." I didn't. Not anymore. There is a porch on the west side of the farmhouse at the ranch. Old wood needs repainting, faces the rolling hills, and catches the late afternoon light in a way that makes everything look like something worth keeping. Matthew repainted it in November 2 weekends, working in the cold with his jacket on, and when he finished he called me out to see it, and we stood there together in the early dark, and I thought of Carl as a young man standing on this land and not knowing what to say about it. I thought of all the things we don't say until we run out of time. I thought of the casserole handed back at the door, and the notary's pen, and the folder with my son's name in it, scheduled for quarterly review. And then I let all of it go. Not because it didn't matter, it mattered enormously, but because I was 70 years old standing on 412 acres of land that belonged to me next to a son who had found his way back, and the work I had set in motion was already reaching people I would never meet in places I would never go, and the ground under my feet was solid and proven and entirely my own. I had not survived this story. I had written it. Every document, every phone call, every quiet decision made in the dark of a hard night, that was authorship. That was a woman refusing to be a footnote in someone else's plan, and insisting at 69 years old on being the main character of her own life. Whatever comes next, I face it standing up on ground that is mine, with the knowledge that the strongest thing I ever did was refuse to believe that I was powerless, and that every woman who reads this in whatever city, in whatever house, at whatever age, carries that same refusal inside her, waiting to be chosen. I chose it, and I would choose it again every single time.